Hi there, everyone. You've caught me just as I finished sneezing. I was having a right old sneezing fit just before the lovely Cameron from Disruptive, who do all of this for free for us. He was going live in 10, 9, and I'm going, achoo, achoo. And I was glad I stopped, but then I've just reenacted it all for you anyway. So anyway, good evening. Happy Tuesday, everybody. Welcome to this episode of Probably Nothing, whether you're watching live with us at 6 o'clock on Tuesday or whether you're catching up at your own leisure. Thanks so much for joining me. So for those of you who don't know, my name is Karen and I work at the Eve Appeal. I run the Ask Eve information service where people can call or email any type of gynae health query and share their questions and concerns. We started Probably Nothing in June 2020 because we wanted to create a platform and a space where gynae cancer topics can be discussed in an honest, expert and informative way. And this series we've been focusing on inherited risks. So that means sort of familial links, hereditary conditions, etc., that put you at an increased risk of a particular cancer. So there are 5 gynecological cancers in order of prevalence. They are womb, ovarian, cervical, vulval and vaginal. And I think it's quite common for people to think that cancer is hereditary. Out of those 5 cancers, it's womb and ovarian cancer that have some hereditary links that can be passed on and make that person at an increased risk of womb or ovarian cancer. And people often think that you can inherit cancer, but it's actually that the risk, it's the condition that you inherit that increases your risk rather than the actual disease itself. So last week and the week before, we were focusing from, first of all, a sort of professional healthcare perspective, and then the more personal side of things in week 1 and week 2 on the BRCA gene alteration, which in the gynae world increases your risk, your lifetime risk of ovarian cancer. So now we're switching over to womb cancer because, as I just said, womb and ovarian are the 2 gynae cancers that have kind of inherited conditions that increase your risk. And womb cancer, about 4% of cases, I'll let my guest in a second tell you more about it, but about 4% of womb cancer cases are linked to something called Lynch Syndrome. And that is an inherited condition. So, wow, who is my surprise guest? Come in. You've never seen her before. There she is.
Hi, Karen.
It's Tracie.
It's Groundhog Day.
It's back again. People are going to be like, is it just always those 2 on screen? Yes, pretty much. And we're not sorry. Tracie, sorry that you are back for a 3rd week in a row. I promise I'm not going to get you back next week, or maybe I will. But for those of you who don't know, this is the lovely Tracie Miles. She obviously is part of the Eve team. And also, Tracie, I said your NHS job title last time. You say it this time and explain what that means, please, my darling.
All right, lovely. So it's lovely to see you on your sofa again. And I am still this week the Associate Director of Nursing and Midwifery for the Southwest Genomic Medicine Alliance. So a Genomic Medicine Alliance is something that you taxpayers pay for. It's an NHS service. The country is divided into 7 regions, and I'm in the Southwest. And that service alliance, Genomic Medicine Service Alliance, it aims to actually embed and to help NHS paying patients and their families get the right genomic test or genetic test at the right time. It's a kind of new thing. It's been going about a year.
And what does genomics mean? People will have heard the word genetics, but I don't think as many people hear the word genomics as much. What is that the same as genetics, like inherited stuff?
Yeah, sort of. So genetics, when we're talking about genetics, we tend to think of, you know, that double helix thing looks great on t-shirts.
Yeah.
So we're all made up of pairs of genes. And so we talked about the BRCA gene, which is BRCA1 and 2. So that's 2 particular genes. We're going to talk about different ones today. So that's specific genetics. Genomics is the whole genome, is everybody's set of genes and or what, like the noise in between that double helix. So we all have a whole genome. So it's a lot more of an information package, which includes all of your genetics, really. So more information about you.
More information. Okay. And so we spoke the other week about BRCA gene alteration. So everyone has the BRCA genes, and then the alteration is when something's gone wrong in the BRCA1 or BRCA2. We're going to talk about Lynch syndrome today. Is that the same case for Lynch syndrome? Like, is Lynch syndrome a sort of faulty gene? What is Lynch syndrome?
So it's a very similar situation in that it's an inherited risk predisposition gene, which basically means, as with the BRCA side of things, just as you said at the top of your show, Karen, it doesn't mean that if
I love that you say my show, the top of your show. I'm like, yeah, it is.
Listen,
and now I've got a hair stuck on my face. Oh, there it is.
You sure it's not the false eyelash?
All right. I am wearing. Don't be bitchy. Don't throw me under the bus. People might have just thought, wow, there's some natural glamour on a Tuesday. And instead, you just bulldoze in.
This is my last chance to wear the false eyelashes. I'll be off next week, I know. Where were we? Oh, yeah, BRCA genes and Lynch.
Yeah.
So it's a similar sort of situation, as it's in an inherited risk disposition. Because as you were saying at the top of your show, when you had one extra eyelash than you have now, what it means is that you are not you're not going to get a cancer because you've got an alteration in these genes. You are simply at a higher risk of getting a cancer. So it's your lifetime risk is elevated. So when we were talking about BRCA last week, a woman's lifetime risk is 2%, depending on which BRCA alteration or mutation she has. It can go up to about 70, 80%. So that's what that means. When we were talking about genes the last couple of weeks, we were talking about BRCA1 or BRCA2. Lynch is a collective
just one thing.
Yeah, well, yes and no, actually. It's a collective name. So no, really. It's a collective name for, it's numbers this time, harder to remember. MLH1, MSH2 and 6, PMS2 and EPCAM. Can never remember all of those.
And are those four things that you just listed, are they the MLH gene? Are they four separate genes?
They are four separate genes, and collectively, if you get a change, so we bundle them all together, and if you get an alteration or a change in one or two of those, that is known as Lynch syndrome.
Okay, so you don't have to have, so let's just call them 1, 2, 3 and 4, because I cannot remember any of what you just said. So if you're watching this and you've remembered even one of those numbers and letters that she just blurted out, you're a better person than I am. So let's call them 1, 2, 3 and 4. So like with BRCA, like you can you don't have two BRCA alterations at the same time, do you? You either have BRCA1 or BRCA2, or can you have
generally it's 1 or 2.
Yeah. 1 or 2. And with 1, 2, 3 and 4 with Lynch, is it more likely that I've just got a broken number 1, or is it more likely that I've got broken 1 and 3, or 1, 2, 3 and 4?
It's more likely that you've got one of them that's broken, something wrong with one of them. Gets a little bit more tricky in that one of them, the one that's called EPCAM, can knock out or alter the PMS2. But basically,
what do you mean it can knock out? Like, how can?
So it can create a predisposition for that particular gene, the PMS2, not to work so well. So it's sort of like a domino knock-on effect. But to be honest, as you say, trying to remember all those numbers and what's it, you know, there's actually no need to, because what will happen is when a woman is tested, and we can chat about that in a while if you like, actually it's what that test shows, whether or not there's a change. And if there is a change, what they're looking is, they're called mismatch repair genes. They're kind of like genes that check for cells that aren't made properly or growing out of control. A bit like, people often call them the policeman of the cells. I quite like
a weird image. I kind of get that.
Yeah. So those genes, those four of them, they sort of patrol the body, checking out to make sure that these cells, any cells that aren't working properly or are dividing too quickly in particular areas of the body, in this case in the Lynch syndrome areas, which we can talk about, if those genes aren't working properly, then you are at an elevated risk of cancer.
Okay, so having one or more of those numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4 genes not working as they should.
Yeah.
Then that means you have Lynch syndrome. It's something you have.
You've been reading. You've been reading ahead of time through those eyelashes. I've got to stop it because you'll come back so hard and so fast if I'm not careful. So,
I will ruin you,
and I'll never come back again. No. So, but actually, you're right, Karen. The thing is even if you have a change in those mismatch repair. So if you're what's called mismatch repair protein deficient, one of those numbers that we were looking at, it doesn't necessarily mean that you've got Lynch syndrome. It means, yeah. So this is where it's different.
Yeah, because if you have BRCA1 or BRCA2, that gene altered, you have the BRCA1 gene alteration. You either have it or you don't, sort of thing.
Yes, yeah. And you're more likely, you've got that increased risk, as we were talking about before, of ovarian or breast cancer. So this is different. If you've got we call it MMRD, the mismatch protein repair deficiency. So if one of those policemen are knocked out, it means you are potentially likely to have Lynch syndrome, but not an absolute definite. So what you need to have done is a blood test called a germline blood test after you've spoken to a genetic counsellor who will talk in depth
onto all of that.
So you then get tested to see whether or not you have Lynch, because just because you've got one of those, if you're lacking in one of those proteins, doesn't necessarily mean Lynch. It means you might have, but you need a further test to find out. So that's really different.
So is it kind of fair to say it's a bit, I mean, this might be kind of insulting to people that work in this world, but is it fair to say that Lynch is less clear cut than BRCA in determining whether what your status is?
It's a different, it's not so clear cut so when the patient comes in with, let's call her a woman, the woman comes in with a cancer, and if it's an ovarian cancer, it is much more clear cut in that we can take a piece of the ovarian cancer tissue and we can test her blood, and then we'll know whether or not
she's got a BRCA alteration or not. Yeah,
exactly. And we can do it actually in most cases by just testing a piece of the tissue, the cancer tissue. You're right. In Lynch, it's different. When we test a piece of the cancer tissue, so this is the womb cancer that we're talking about in this situation, then all that will tell us is whether or not one of these police cells, if you like, one of these, whether or not these mismatch repair proteins, if she is deficient in them. If it's deficient in them, it means she's got a probability of having Lynch, but not definitely. We have to do the blood test to prove it.
Do that extra test. Okay. Yeah. And you've already mentioned womb, and I mentioned womb at the beginning. So what cancers are you at an increased risk of if those tests do come back and hello, Tracie, you've got Lynch syndrome? What does that mean for you?
Okay. So Lynch syndrome means an increased risk of, in the main, colorectal, also known as bowel cancer.
And a colorectal and bowel, the same thing. They're used interchangeably.
Yeah, exactly. So that's an increased risk. Then an increased risk of womb cancer, as you said, and an increased risk, but not as much, of ovary cancer. So the ovary cancer is still an element. It's about 24% increased risk. So the general population of women with ovaries, their risk is 2%. It's about
of getting ovarian cancer.
Yeah. And it's increased to about 24% with Lynch.
See, that's a lot. That feels like it's not the little afterthought. No.
And it's really important. And the EVP are looking at work where we don't sort of forget that ovary is part of the picture as well.
Yeah, it definitely feels like this sort of general public conversation as we're learning more about it, and things like BRCA and Lynch are more out there in the media and stuff. It definitely feels like it's womb and bowel that are mentioned, and then like a little whisper about ovarian.
Yeah.
So your risk is increased to about 24% of ovarian. And is it much more for womb and bowel, or a bit more?
So for womb, it's around about 60%, and for bowel, it's around about 80%.
So if I had Lynch syndrome, there's an 80% chance that in my lifetime I'll get bowel cancer.
Yeah.
And 60% womb. So even though I said 24 is a lot for ovarian, that is obviously, it does sort of pale away when you compare it to, I mean, 60 and 80%. That's a scary amount, Trace.
It is. But what we can do is, where with ovarian cancer and things we've talked about in the past, it's really hard to screen for ovarian cancer. So the most successful screening obviously is cervix cancer screening. We're not talking about that today though, but screening gives people an idea when we're talking about doing tests to check and to make sure
it's the language people get. Yeah.
So with ovary cancer, despite oodles of money and time and women giving their time to check, we still don't have a definitive. We're getting closer, but we're not there yet on a screening.
There's no equivalent of the cervical, is there?
No, absolutely not. But what we can do, if we know somebody's got Lynch syndrome, we can screen them. They can screen their bowel. So that's having a colonoscopy. So that means that and every 2 years, if we know somebody has got Lynch syndrome, then they have a colonoscopy. We check the inside of their bowel. So that is the unpleasant tube inside the bottom, a camera, but actually it saves lives. So we do that.
And so you've listed like the 24, the 60, the 80 approximately lifetime risk. Is this a silly question? But because bowel is at like 80%, does that mean that, like, if I had Lynch syndrome, I'm probably going to get bowel cancer first? Or is that a silly thing to say? Like, do more people basically find out they have Lynch syndrome through bowel cancer or through like your womb gynae?
Yeah, no, it's not a silly thing to say, because actually
it makes sense that it would, you know.
So but actually for women, the womb cancer is what we call the sentinel or the signal in medics terms. You and I would say the first cancer that somebody's
really?
So
that doesn't make sense to me, because it's less of a risk than bowel. So that to me is like, why is the second most common or risk, the second biggest risk, going first?
So it's just the way us girls are made.
So
the important thing is though, but you're absolutely right, Karen. So because womb cancer, if we catch it early enough, is generally caught early enough. If a woman just goes to her doctor with the signs of symptoms, get bleeding check. We say it all the time.
Check all of our website, check all of our socials, read up on the symptoms, read.
So if we get that detected soon enough, and our patient with womb cancer has a hysterectomy, that is likely if it's early stage to be a curative cancer. If we don't check to see in that womb cancer that's being removed whether or not there is a change in those police proteins, if you like, and don't detect whether or not she's got Lynch syndrome, we could potentially cure someone from her womb cancer, send her off back out into the world, and not keep an eye on her for her colon cancer.
Because why would you if you don't know anything?
Well, exactly. And if we do that, because the other thing, as well as surveillance every 2 years, checking the lining of the bowel with a colonoscopy, we also know that aspirin, simple help your hangover aspirin, unless you use paracetamol, Karen. No, we won't go into hangovers. We haven't got time today.
These eyelashes have been on for 7 days straight.
So simple aspirin, cheapest chips aspirin, taken at a low dose, we know is what we call chemoprotective. So it means that people with Lynch syndrome, if they take aspirin on a regular basis, prescribed by their doctor and monitored, can actually reduce the risk of them getting a colon cancer. How amazing is that?
Actual thing.
That's a thing. That's an actual thing.
Would you understand if everyone watching this suddenly then started taking a daily aspirin? Because I'm tempted to. Like, that makes me think, oh God, I should go and get aspirin.
Absolutely. The thing is aspirin also has side effects in that it can alter the thinness of our blood. So it's called an anticoagulant. So for some people, it's not the right thing to take. So you
have to speak. So even though you can buy it in the shop, you said about being prescribed, because it's a conversation you have to have.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But for the right people, so people with Lynch syndrome, a woman who's been cured of her womb cancer, or a woman or a man who doesn't have a colon cancer or colorectal cancer, it's absolutely the conversation to be had by a GP. And that's why we need to test people for Lynch syndrome, because we can actually save lives that way.
So from our gynae angle, so we'll stick with the womb and ovaries, the gynae angle, rather than like guys and colorectal, just bowel and stuff.
Yes,
so a typical, so say, because we spoke again in BRCA about the different ways people find out they have the inherited condition. So there's obviously, if you have cancer and you find out that way, or if you find out because of a family history, someone else having cancer. So a typical, because we've got 10 minutes left and we could obviously go on about these sorts of things forever, but let's go with the typical, even though we understand everyone's situation is different and there's no one size fits all, but a typical Lynch picture for a woman or someone with gynae anatomy is that they will have a womb cancer first, typically, if they're going to find out via getting diagnosed, if that's their route. And is that like, oh, you start to see cancers at 40, or is this like you've got a 20-year-old with womb cancer and you think this isn't right? Like, is there sort of an age estimate?
And of course, as you say, every individual is different, but you are right, Karen. Cancer tends to be womb cancer, a cancer of the postmenopausal woman. You can have a go at me now if you like. Had your chance. So
I wouldn't stoop so low. I'm going to put curling spray in now while I talk to you. That's how little I think of you.
And I love you too, darling.
I love you.
So cancer, womb cancer tends to be, as we see with ovarian cancer, a cancer of the postmenopausal woman. So she's 52 plus generally. If we see womb cancer in this situation, we're talking about Lynch, in the younger woman, we are more likely to think to the light bulb to go off Lynch. It doesn't mean that because she's menopausal over 52 that we shouldn't test to see if she's got, see if she's got Lynch. But if she's younger, we definitely, the light bulb should go off and we should be thinking, I wonder if we've got Lynch in the family. And so every conversation that we have with the patient now, it's asking our patient about family history. So if we've got listeners out there, or, or your regular friends who just tune in to see your hair curling, and they know they have cancer in the family. Now we know everybody says, and they're right, I've got cancer in my family, because we know 1 in 3 people have cancer. But we're talking about if we know that we have a lot of womb cancer or bowel colorectal cancer in the family, and possibly ovary, as we were saying, then that's when we should be thinking, well, I wonder if. So it is age. The younger she is, if she's under 52, we are likely to think, I wonder if this is Lynch.
And so say she's got a womb cancer, been diagnosed and tested for Lynch, and but it's fair to say, isn't it, that testing people with womb cancer for Lynch isn't an age-old thing. It's quite new in the grand scheme of the world. And before the quite recent addition to including womb cancer patients in Lynch testing, wasn't it just that every bowel cancer patient was tested, or was it only some before?
You're right. And you're right. You're right. And you're right. And you're right. So yes, so NICE, National Institute of Clinical Excellence, about 5-7 years ago, looked at colorectal, because that was the biggest proportion of people with Lynch, and said, look, you should be offering it to all colorectal patients. It was only a couple of years ago, actually, that
just quickly. So I said at the beginning that about 4-ish% of womb cancer patients are linked to Lynch syndrome. Is it more or less like bowel cancer patients? Because I know bowel cancer is much more common. It's one of the big 4, but is it still about 4%?
It's about 3-4% for the womb cancer, and it's around about 5-ish%. You'll see different numbers in different books, blogs, etc. But you're right about, so colorectal cancer, that NICE got there first, because there are more people with colorectal cancer and the risk is higher. And then NICE then did another specialist review, and actually the Eve appeal worked really hard with a number of agencies, but the Eve appeal represented the third sector, the charity sector. And a couple of years ago, NICE said, and rightly so, that every woman with endometrial cancer should be offered Lynch testing. And in
because
fact,
they will get that first. It's a clue to the future, and they'll more likely survive a womb cancer than a bowel. So why wouldn't we do this?
Absolutely.
We have to give a big shout out to Emma and Neil, don't we? They probably won't watch it. They're our lovely friends that are, they're a little bit cleverer than Tracie, a lot more intelligent than me. Emma Crosby and Neil Ryan really led with work on womb cancer patients being tested for Lynch, didn't they? And they're lovely friends with Eve as well, and they're amazing. And so say someone is diagnosed with womb cancer, finds out they have Lynch, they then will be offered the colonoscopy, camera at the bottom, testing, surveillance for bowel. And what if, say they are diagnosed with bowel first? Not as likely, but say at 35 years old, they get a bowel cancer, they're tested, they've got Lynch syndrome. Like, is it kind of a case of we can monitor your womb, or we should advise to take the womb out? How with BRCA patients, if you will, it's advised when they've completed their families or to consider taking the ovaries out. Is it the same sort of thing with the womb, or is it easier to survey at a distance than the ovaries?
It's not easy. It's a really tricky one. So to do a surveillance of the womb, so if earlier on we were talking about the cervix, that's fairly easy. That's when we go for our cervix screening. So, but of course, to screen the womb, you've got to get through the cervix, which can be an uncomfortable procedure, and you've got to take a biopsy, a piece of that tissue. So that's called a hysteroscopy and biopsy. Now, a number of studies have been done to see how useful that is. And of course, that's only taking a tiny little bit of tissue. So we don't know the best way to do womb surveillance. The best way actually at the moment is the signs and symptoms, all of the stuff that we've got on our website. And in fact, Emma Crosby, who you were talking about, so Emma, who's the professor in Manchester, who worked with Neil, she's currently, I was talking to her the other day, and she's currently looking at doing a kind of trial to try and work out what is the best way to care for women for surveillance for the womb. So to be honest, we don't know the best way at the moment.
If someone finds out they have Lynch through a bowel cancer diagnosis, is it kind of fair to say that if they are postmenopausal, they're more likely to say, oh, I'll just take my womb out? Would they be offered a hysterectomy?
Yes. So that's called risk-reducing surgery. As you said, with the BRCA, that would be the womb and ovaries removed once a woman is past childbearing age. And also with BRCA, she'll also look at having her breast removed. Those are also organs at risk. So it's a similar principle. Huge surgery compared to having ovaries out. I'm not negating how rubbish it is for every woman who goes through all of this, but so womb and ovaries, so that's big surgery. So, and of course that then completely cuts out the chance of having a baby. I'm going to say naturally, define natural these days, but by carrying a baby. So it's by no means
a lot to think about, isn't it?
But the risk-reducing hysterectomy and ovaries are offered.
Regardless of your age. It's just understandably more likely someone post-menopause is going to say sure, compared to someone that's still in their fertile years. It's a lot. And we're slightly running out of time. So I just want to ask you quickly about the other side of it. So, okay, my mum and my auntie and my granddad have all had a mixture of bowel and womb cancer. So obviously I'm going to listen to this and be like, well, I've got Lynch syndrome. So what happens if you're worried about your risk because of your family, but you haven't yourself got a bit of paper with a cancer diagnosis? How do you find out from there?
Okay, so what you do is you talk to your family and you find out a bit more.
Take down the history as much as you can.
Exactly. But understanding that you might not be able to talk to your family. And then if you're worried, what you do is you go to your GP and you say, look, I was watching Karen and Tracie on this show, Karen's show. And I'm a bit worried that, you know, listening to them, my mum, my auntie and my granddad, gosh, I wonder if. And actually that's the point where the GP can then take a family history. Now, we know that a GP only has around about 10 minutes. We get that a GP doesn't have much time. But in that time, the GP can take a family history and then can talk to clinical genetics, who are the people that you would need to see if they felt it was relevant.
Okay, so your GP, like with BRCA, like with all genetic testing, if you don't have the cancer diagnosis to prompt it, is the person to speak to the clinical genetics and refer. And with this, is it the same with BRCA in that there's counselling around it as well because of the understandably, like, just, it's a big decision to find, like, because if you find out, you're probably thinking, well, then I probably should do something about it. So I can imagine some people almost don't want to find out.
Yeah. There's a thing called decision regret, which was being written about loads about people say, gosh, I wish I'd never found out. Actually, to be honest, of all the women that I've looked after over the years, I've never encountered that, and neither of any of my colleagues. But it doesn't mean that it's not a thing, because it's written about. So it's not something that anybody should take lightly.
And okay, we're only 1 minute over, so I will wrap up almost on time. What, in terms of, if people are sort of concerned or like have watched this and some red flags are raised, what kind of just last, like, sort of to go away advice would you give them if people have watched this and it sort of stirred something?
Okay, so I hope we haven't worried people, and I hope we've reassured people that here at the Eve Appeal, if you've got a question to ask about anything, whether it's about genetics or anything gynae, you simply go to Ask Eve, which is where you'll find Karen.
nurse@eveappeal.org.uk. That is nurse@eveappeal.org.uk. Thank you.
Which is where you'll find Karen, who then, if she wants to refer a question, there are two of us. Hilary is wonderful, Hilary Maxwell, and she will take calls, or rather she will call you back if you would like a phone call, or she'll email you. If it's
There's
something
a space
genetic,
to have a chat, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And similarly, I'm around to talk about anything genetic, or if Hilary's on holiday, Karen will get hold of me.
Yes, I'll pester you, don't worry. Okay, thank you very much, my darling. Go and wait backstage and I'll say goodbye to you in a second.
It's a pleasure. Okay, I'll wait backstage.
See you in a
minute.
minute.
Cameron will put me there.
Thank you so much, everybody who either tuned in live to watch this session on Lynch syndrome, or if you're catching up in your own time, thanks so much for joining in. I hope you found it informative, and as Tracie plugged away at the end, the Ask Eve expert and free nurse-led service that we run at the Eve Appeal is there for you to talk about whatever you want to talk about, ask whatever question you want to ask. Yeah, we're there for you, and we welcome you coming to us with any of your concerns. So next week is the last episode of this current series of Probably Nothing, and like we did with the BRCA sort of professional then personal, and we've had Lynch, the professional sort of medical side of it today, we're going to finish the series by speaking to somebody who has been personally affected by Lynch syndrome, to kind of give that lived experience and balance the science that we've sort of thrown at you. So yeah, please do join in. Join in. That's a tune and a join, isn't it? Now I've mucked it up. I've mucked the end up. What a way to go. I started sneezing and I stumbled on my way out. Oh, well, that's the beauty of live theatre. Please do join us next week, Tuesday the 26th at 6 p.m. Yeah, and we'll be talking about the personal experience of Lynch syndrome. Until then, thank you so much for watching and stay safe.